Good evening, everyone. It's great to see you here. Thank you so much. I want to say welcome to not only you who are sitting here in this auditorium, but also to the people who are online. So we're thrilled that you're here to join us for our Jesuits conversation series. This is a great opportunity for us to have a really robust conversation about something very timely and provocative, reshaping the church for today's world through synodality. This event is sponsored by the LMU Jesuit community, the CSJ Center for Reconciliation and Justice, the Office of the Chancellor, and the Office of the Vice President for Mission and Ministry. So thank you all very much for that. So we won't delay too long, but I would like to I would like to introduce our two distinguished guests, Carol Costello. She is an award-winning journalist and former anchor and correspondent at CNN and HLN. Her distinguished career as a local, regional, and national broadcaster spans 3 decades, covering a broad range of world leaders, events, and politics. She has won an Emmy Award for her reporting on the crack cocaine epidemic, a DuPont for her coverage of the Indonesian tsunami, and 2 Emmy Award nominations for broadcast performance and Best Morning Show. Carol also participated in CNN's Peabody Award-winning coverage of Hurricane Katrina and the 2008 presidential election. She now produces the true crime podcast, Blind Rage, and teaches journalism here at Loyola Marymount University. So it's great to have you here. Our other guest, Father Agbonkhianmeghe Orobator, is a Jesuit from Nigeria. He currently serves as the Dean of the Jesuit School of Theology at Santa Clara University. He previously served as the Provincial of the East African Province and as the President of the Jesuit Conference of Africa and Madagascar. He's the author of The Pope and the Pandemic, Lessons in Leadership in a Time of Crisis, Religion and Faith in Africa, Confessions of an Animist, and Theology Brewed in an African Pot. Let's give him a warm welcome. And my apologies, I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Father Eddie Siebert. I'm the Jesuit rector, not as exciting as these two, but again, I'm thrilled you're here. I'm going to turn it over right away to Father Orobator, and he's going to talk a little bit about his experience at the Synod, and then Carol's going to follow up with some questions. And then afterwards, we'll all have a chance to chime in and ask questions. And then following this, there will be a reception. I'll say a little bit more about that in about an hour. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eddie. And thank you for the invitation. Particularly grateful to you, Mark, for all the back and forth correspondence, which finally led to this. And also thank you, Carol, for the opportunity to have this conversation with you. I was invited to talk about some highlights, high points, moments from the second session of the Synod, and I can do that for 10 minutes. When I walked into Paul VI Hall, it seemed like the church had been concentrated into that space, representing a diversity of personalities, peoples, places, events, issues that are of consequence in the church today. Something else that was striking for me was the architecture of the space, because just above that hall was this purpose-built Synod Hall, very much like this amphitheater, which was not used for the second session. The second session was a collection of round tables of people of different backgrounds, stations, status, situations, gathered around and having a conversation in the Spirit. A conversation that covered every topic that was of importance and consequence to people wherever they came from. But not only that, what I experienced was an opportunity to see the church in making. I've often said that the Synod is not about reconfiguring the church. It's really about remodeling. It's about finding new paths, new ways of living and being church that represents God's will for the church today. But it was a space where all issues could be discussed, irrespective of what was out there in the media. From my recollection, there was no issue that was off the table. The controversial issues around sexual orientation, gender identity, the LGBTQ community, the question of women's role and ordination and the diaconate of women in the church. The idea of co-responsibility of lay women and lay men for the life and mission of the church. The whole issue of transparency, accountability, and evaluation of leadership. All of these were issues on the table. But interestingly for me as a theologian, it was exciting to see synodality being modeled in real time as an invitation to listen, to discern, and to be in relationship as the body of Christ, the people of God. Sitting at that table with people from different parts of the world and knowing that each one had a voice, had equal amount of time to make his or her point. There was something about it that modeled a new way of being church, where one's privilege, status, does not determine how much space, how much time one has when it comes to contributing to these issues of consequence. Yes, I also experienced moments of real tension and resistance to the very idea of synodality. I remember one of the very first challenging questions that the Synod had to deal with was to determine the legitimacy, the authority of a synod of bishops that includes non-bishops. Or, as they put it elegantly, people who are not endowed with ecclesiastical dignity, like us. But I saw at that moment the intervention of the chief architect of the Synod, Pope Francis, throwing light on the very idea of the people of God and reminding the audience, reminding the members of the Synod that the foundational, the primary element is belonging to the people of God. That is what gives each person access to the synodal space. Because every member of the people of God is a baptized Christian. And there is no status, no standing higher than baptism. And therefore, when it comes to the synod, as walking together, journeying together, every baptized member of the people of God has access to the synodal table. I also know that there are questions about, so what? I am convinced that based on the experience I had in the synodal hall, that synodality allows us to begin a process, of engaging with one another as people of God over issues that matter to us, issues that also tend to divide us, in a way that we can maintain our place at the table in dialogue, in conversation, hoping that so doing, we can hear better what the Spirit says to the church and also recognize across the table a member of the people of God who is not an adversary, but a sister and a brother who loves the church just as well. When I recall the composition of the synodal hall or the synodal body, two other things stand out for me. First, the youthfulness of that composition. I remember one of the youngest members of the synod was a college student from the US. And to see people like him stand up and address the synod about issues that young people care about the young being the now, not the future of the church. That, for me, was consoling. There was something else about that composition. There were 54 women invited to the synod, unprecedented, invited by Pope Francis himself. And to listen and hear these synodal members define themselves on their own terms was for me quite pivotal. And to hear these members of the synod remind the church that it's about time as a community we refrain from talking about women as problem, as question, or as issue. That was a voice that needed to be heard and could only have been articulated with such potency, I would say, and in such a compelling manner by people who were directly affected. And so, recalling these moments of my time at the synod, especially the second session, for me, gives me real hope for what lies ahead. And I'll finish with this last point. And this, for me, probably stands out above all else. And that is that at the end of the synod, after all the voting had been completed on the final document, Pope Francis, when he spoke to bring the synod to a closure, surprised everyone and declared that there will be no apostolic exhortation, that this final document will become the roadmap sufficient to guide our actions going forward. Now, that was unprecedented, given that the document itself included issues that were still contentious, that some had hoped that in the process of polishing up the document to prepare it for a final exhortation, many of these issues will be ironed out. Francis surprised us all and declared that this final document would be the final document of the Synod. And he followed that up a few weeks later to say that this document is now part of the official magisterium, official teaching of the Roman Catholic Church. That, for me, is unprecedented. And it confirms for me that this process initiated by the Synod is, without a question, a path that leads to not a new church, but a different church, as Pope Francis himself will put it. So let's have a conversation.
Let's do it. That was fascinating. As I was researching the Synod, which is no easy task because it's complicated, I suddenly realized that exactly what you said, it's a process about the process, which is really hard to wrap your head around when most Catholics want something to happen, especially American Catholics. So can you just dial down a little bit about why the process is so important?
Thank you. Well, let me acknowledge the fact that when I talk about process, I'm actually borrowing the idea from Pope Francis himself. He has this insight that creating processes is more important than occupying space. Because when we occupy space, we stake our ideological positions and we are immovable. When we create processes, we open a way for us to move forward and to engage, knowing that it is incomplete in itself, but there is always a horizon to aim for. And so rather than bicker over ideological differences and remain stuck in our entrenched position, synodality as a process offers us a way to become a bit unstuck, engage, and take one step forward.
So move forward while listening to all voices.
Listening to all voices.
But I couldn't get out of my mind that the church isn't a democracy, right? Where majority rules. So I was left wondering about how much impact those voices would have, even though maybe bishops are now required to listen to those voices.
Well, it means that.
I know that was not.
No, it means that for me, as I see it, having a voice and using it is important. And I'm convinced now that if we are thinking about how we use our voices to call for change, transparency, accountability, that's not going to come necessarily from the pulpit. It's going to come from the pews. I think it's important that as the community, as the body of Christ, as members of the people of God, we begin to realize that we have agency. And where does that come from? Very clearly, it comes from our baptismal dignity. We have agency, and that empowers us to be co-responsible. I think one of the things that the Synod actually does, when you take it back to how the Second Vatican Council considered the division of labor within the church, where, if it's a question of leadership and governance, it's reserved for those with orders. If it's about sanctifying the secular world, then let the lay lead the way. What synodality calls us to is that there is co-responsibility for the life and mission of the church. We have equal responsibility for sanctifying the secular order, but also for the life and mission of the church.
That's amazing. Just going back to the process itself, 350 people roughly,
Plus.
70 lay people, including women.
Yes.
So the second session, was there a sense that the bishops just wanted it to go back to the old way where it was only the bishops participating in the synod? And if there was that tension there, how was it batted down?
Well, as I just mentioned, yes, there was that question of, the legitimacy, the authority of a synod of bishops that includes non-bishops. There was certainly a question there. And in fact, I think this has been widely reported, there was even a suggestion that we could have a two-tiered system where we can have an assembly of the people of God. Everybody comes. And then we have a proper synod that really makes the decisions about what everybody else talked about. So, but as I mentioned, you have to understand, well, at least Pope Francis made us understand that a synod is an institution within the church itself. It doesn't have priority over the church considered as the people of God. And remember him saying very clearly, everybody comes from the people of God. And we don't stand over and above the people of God. Therefore, there is real legitimacy in a synod, that includes voices, be those voices of bishops, lay women, laymen, religious women and religious men, and priests.
So when that idea came up, that there would be like this special synod, and right, when the tension arose, you as a theologian were called in to sort of diffuse the tension. You spoke in a public forum about the bishops and the role they should play in the synod. Can you tell us what you said?
Well, without breaking any confidence.
Oh, come on.
My position, and I still hold the position today, is that when we are called to leadership, episcopal leadership, for those who are called to episcopal leadership, we still have accountability to the people of God. We can talk about being consecrated, set apart, but we are never set above and over others. We still remain accountable, and we facilitate the participation, the dialogue in community. We don't monopolize it. And it's important to make those distinctions as people who have episcopal roles.
So I'll just ask a very simplistic question. Why is it important that every voice be heard? Like the bishops, I don't know, when I grew up Catholic, I couldn't even question my parish priest. So this is big to me to wrap my head around, that you can question a bishop and the bishop will actually hear you and maybe change his mind.
Yes, because, as I said earlier on, our baptism takes precedence over everything else. The primary identity that we carry, that bestows dignity upon us as members of this community, is our baptismal identity. In fact, the final document states it very clearly. By virtue of their baptism, women and men have equal dignity as members of the people of God, paragraph 60. Is that clear?
So one of the mandates that came out of the Synod, bishops are obliged to listen. Pretty simple then, right?
Well,
I'm only asking you that because accountability,
Yes.
right? So what if the bishops decide not to listen? How are they punished, for lack of a better, who holds them accountable?
I think that's an important question. I don't know that we've figured that out yet, and I don't want to assume anything. I know that in principle, that is what the expectation coming out of the Synod is, that there will be transparency, there will be accountability, there will be evaluation, actually, of how our leaders are faring in how they exercise their authority or how they perform in their positions of authority. All of that are the ideals and the principles. In terms of actual mechanism for enforcing that, I don't want to speculate on that, because I know it's not going to be easy. It's an element of reform, and reform, we don't handle reform very well in this community. We don't. And you can be sure that there will be resistance, there will be pushbacks, to these kinds of reform.
I also ask you that because, we think of everything, at least I do, because I'm a journalist, in terms of American politics. And the people that we have in leadership roles right now, it doesn't really matter. Rules don't matter. You just do what you need to do to insert your will, or does that matter when we talk about bishops having a mandate to listen? And if they don't want to, there's no punishment mapped out, so they will reflect on this wave of leaders around the world who are just doing their own thing and not listening to the people necessarily.
Well, I think you raise a very important critical point. What kind of witness are we providing? Are we providing a counter witness to what prevails in the rest of society? And I think, on a personal note, I think people who hold responsibility in the community called church need to remember that their role is part of the proclamation of the gospel, and therefore should be manifesting elements and principles and values of the gospel in how they exercise leadership as a form of witness that counters what we see in society generally. But again, I don't know how you enforce that. I don't know how you enforce that other than to look at those who exemplify that and hope that they will be beacons of light for the rest.
Okay, so in the second round of the Synod too, Pope Francis took away 10 hot button issues and gave them to smaller individual study groups. And those issues were the most controversial: women's ordination, clericalism, LGBTQ issues. What should we make of that?
Well, I struggled with that myself when those 10 issues were taken off the table. But when you look at the justification for it, it makes sense to me. And here's why. When Francis took them off the table, he said these 10 issues require deeper study processes. And when you think of it, a synod doesn't decide on issues. It's an advisory body. It will take another 10 synods, to resolve all of those 10 issues.
Oh, don't say that.
It will, if that's all. But the opportunity to have a close study allows us then to draw on particular expertise, and actually, for me, shortens the process, hoping that these studies are not open-ended. And in fact, Francis says in the document establishing this, that these study groups will be accountable to the Secretariat of the Synod of Bishops. They will be the guarantor of this study process. So in that sense, you could say that we haven't seen the outcomes or the end of these issues yet.
So when the issues were pulled off the table, what was the general reaction?
Dismay, concern. I, for one, was concerned that this may mean that the synodal process is outsourced to a group that is not actually involved in the synod itself. But I think my concern has been largely addressed by the fact that these groups, at least most of the groups, continue to work under I wouldn't say the supervision, but are accountable to the Secretariat for the Synod in terms of their work.
So those 10 study groups who were studying these contentious issues and delving more deeply into them. They had to make presentations too, right? Right?
Yes,
There was one study group. See, you're laughing because you know what study group I'm going to point out. It was study group number 5.
correct,
There was no update because
Correct.
its coordinator was not there.
correct,
Its members were not even listed or known.
correct.
That study group involved women in the ministry. What? I mean, what?
Well, yeah, that was the reaction. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. That was the reaction. And I don't know if you followed up on subsequent engagements.
You were a hero. Yes.
But the point is, again, I think that's where you need a synodal process to which groups like this remain accountable.
Yeah, but did they think they could just sneak that by and no one would notice?
Maybe I don't speak for the group, but the reality is that someone noticed. In fact, more than one person noticed and reminded the group that this is not how synodality functions, and therefore reminded the group of its accountability to the synodal process.
And it was a loud outcry too. There weren't quiet voices saying, what's with study group? It was loud.
It was loud, it was strident, it was persistent.
I think you also made a special statement about that too, in a special meeting about what was up with study group number 5. Can you share with us what you said?
Yes, I can. It's
Yeah.
public now anyway. So here was the concern. First, in terms of the composition of the groups, the idea was that they will be representative of different parts of the church. I didn't think this particular group was representative, even though it claimed to be, because the majority of the members were Italian priests. And I didn't see how that could be representative. I mean, I have nothing against Italian priests. I mean, I think they're wonderful people. But so my point, the first point was, I don't see any African there. I don't see anybody from Madagascar there. So how can that be representative of the global church? The second thing was this idea around the diaconate of women in the church not being mature enough yet to be addressed. And I had issues with that, because if you're thinking maturity, you need to be able to identify by what criteria are you going to determine that an issue is actually mature enough. And if you don't have those criteria, then we're just wasting our time having a conversation, because it's going to be endless. So that was my point, that we needed to have criteria for determining the maturity of this question of the diaconate of women in the church.
Was that ever resolved? I mean, do we know who decides when the issue is mature enough to actually make a decision?
Well, at least I think one of the things that has happened since then is that we have now, at least the Vatican has revived the study commission on the diaconate of women. I think that's a positive step going forward, because it means that we're now actively engaging again with the question. Hopefully, that's going to give us the signs or the criteria of maturity when they produce, hopefully, a final report.
And do we know who's on that commission, or?
It's public.
It's public.
It's public, yeah. It is public.
Do you really think that there will ever be a decision made on that?
No.
That was so nice and honest.
No, because I do believe that the depth of feelings against this idea is remarkably strong. And
Why? Can you help me understand why?
And I include myself in that, we are a patriarchal church. Everything is structured when it comes to leadership, governance, and authority, is structured to give priority to, privilege to, and status to ordained people like me. And people don't give up such privileges easily. People feel threatened by the very idea that this carefully crafted structure of patriarchy will be diluted. And that could affect privileges and perks that people have long ascribed to themselves for centuries. So I would like to see a change, but I know that the resistance is formidable. And I want to be realistic about that.
No, and I appreciate that. I think that, so I guess it boils down to just power.
There is a lot that comes from that. But I would say, one of the things that I have also been consoled by is the way that different groups, especially groups that are committed to this question of women's ministry and the diaconate of women, are going about raising consciousness about the importance. I think, for example, of the group called the Synod Deacons, how they have been consistent in demonstrating that when it comes to ministry, there is so much testimony that we can point to of women leading the way. That it's not a question of diluting, taking away, undermining authority that people might think they have, but it's really affirming the gift, the giftedness that women bring to build this community called church. That's comforting.
Yes. I think Pope Francis somewhat makes it confusing because he just appointed a woman an important Vatican position, but he also appointed a man to oversee her as a co-leader, which sends a confusing message.
Well, no, I think, if you're thinking, for example, of the dicastery for consecrated life, I think Sister Brambila is the prefect, and she has authority like any other prefect would have. If you're thinking of the governorate of the Vatican, the woman he appointed has authority to exercise her role as the governor of the Vatican state. I don't think that these are people who are going to be supervised by other people. But you see, that's not really my concern. My concern when I think of it is coming to a point where these kinds of appointments will not make headline news because they have become the norm. That's how we function as a church. I am still not convinced that it's enough to identify, a small number of positions of authority and appoint women there. The only thing that should satisfy us is when these positions become open to everybody and there are no barriers of gender.
So I think that for progressive Catholics, the Synod was interesting. I think for conservative Catholics, I don't think conservative Catholics are entirely happy either. But is that a good thing? Because doesn't that mean that, I don't know, I'm thinking of it in terms of journalism. Like if you don't make anyone happy, you're doing your job.
Yeah, no, I struggle with this polarization. I'm not used to this way of categorizing right, left, progressive, conservative, all of these binaries I find challenging to deal with. Because I think if we look at it from this perspective, no one is ever going to be happy. No one is ever going to be happy. But I don't think that as a community, as a church, the rest of the world thinks this way necessarily. I don't think so. I think what I experience, at least coming from my context in the global South, is more conciliatory and less polarizing about, into very rigid ideological positions. I think that's something we also need to overcome. Otherwise, we would always find adversaries. We would always find people to fight.
I do think that Catholics in the United States forget that Catholicism is worldwide and not everybody thinks the same. And not everybody thinks that the issues we care about are important on a global scale. I mean, that has to be challenging for anyone who runs the church or wants to find a new path forward.
I would imagine so. But see, in saying that, I wouldn't simply dismiss the issues that people care about in this part of the world. Otherwise, there's no point of synodality, because synodality is really about lifting up those issues. But it's important to also put them side by side other issues and realize that we don't monopolize the space for whatever reason because we want to focus only. If the church is Catholic, what concerns people here should also be what concerns me coming from the global South. If we're talking about the church as a body, as the people of God, I think that having that global mindset is a challenge for anyone, wherever you're coming from in this reality called church.
Before we open it up to Q&A, I did want to ask you about Pope Francis. He's in the hospital. According to Cardinal Dolan, he's not doing well. And, I just want to get your thoughts on that because, I don't know, it hurts me to think of him dying.
We all have a duty, I think, to continue to hold him up in our prayers and entrust him to the care and the mercy and compassion of God at this very, very difficult moment. I want to think of it not so much as, what are we going to lose as a church, or what are we losing as a church? What does this mean for us as a church? I also want to pay attention to just how personal this moment will be for the man himself. And to pay attention to that, to pray that he's living this moment with courage, with peace, and with joy. I cannot speculate on what the outcome would be, but I know that when I pray that God will keep Pope Francis with us for a while longer.
I pray that too. Just looking forward for just a bit. I think Pope Francis has been very smart in positioning the church to continue on with the way he would like the church to be run. Do you feel confident that that is so? I
do, because, and here's why. I think one of the things that he has done so well is to give visibility to the church as a global community. And whether it's in the places he has been to, the people he has called into leadership in his leadership, the people he has appointed as cardinals. And I think these all point to the fact that he's thinking of the church as a global community, and therefore one that is able to draw on the gifts and the resources available across the globe. Yeah.
Do you think his cardinals would dare choose another Jesuit?
Okay.
See, that's a good. likes to stop and open it up for Q&A. So I turn it over to you, Father Eddie.
Thank you.
Thank you both. You've got the microphones, right? So maybe Nick's on this side and Colin, you'll head over there. So at this time, we only have about 10 minutes, but I think there's enough to think about and to talk about. So we'll start with maybe Father Rausch. Do you want to start us off with some questions?
Yeah, thank you very much for this, marvelous conversation. Carol, you've been pushing very hard on how do you get the bishops to move on what comes out of that. And so I want to make two very brief points. The role of the bishops and the Pope is to reflect the faith of the church, and not just to rule and to govern. And the other issue is the importance of unity. Let me say that you were a cardinal, Carol, and you're called upon to vote on the ordination of women to the diaconate. And it's going to split the church because there's a lot of opposition to Pope Francis. They don't like his economic policy. They don't like his teaching on sexuality, his openness to gays. So you're a cardinal, and it's going to split the church, but it's the right thing to do. What would you do? And then the second thing is, Father Orobator, what's this issue of, not just going with a majority vote, but trying to get this issue to mature in the life of the church, to preserve the church's unity, so that when this decision was made, it would be something welcomed by the church and not really splitting it or dividing it.
Oh, well, I, as a cardinal, would say, go women. We're always the sacrificial lamb. Right?
Well, I don't know how this is looked at from the inside, in terms of what potential this has for splitting or not splitting the church. But if that's a concern, my question will be, then when are we ever going to move? When are we ever going to change? When are we ever going to have change in this church? Now, I believe that unity is important, but can we have unity that recognizes that as a church, there is no one fixed center around which all of us should be congregating, but there are constellations of peripheries that we need to be lifting up and prioritizing in a way that even if there are practices within a periphery, we can recognize the importance of that practice for that particular space and time and location, and not seek to fuse everything into just one reality that applies to everybody. We had this conversation during the Synod on the Amazonia about the possibility of creating ministries for people within that context that responds to the needs of people within that context. I would like to think that doing that shouldn't become an excuse for people to split the church apart. Because these are real concerns for real people in a particular context. How do we address those issues if we're not willing? If we're not willing to make, if we're not open to the possibility of doing things differently. I think if we become too paralyzed by our concern for unity, we also leave out many opportunities for the church as a community to go forward. I'm not a cardinal. I don't know what goes through the mind of a cardinal when they, consider these issues. But in my opinion, God certainly must have ideas for how the church continues to be united while responding to the gifts of the people of God and making use of those gifts to build God's church. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you for being here. I have two questions. First, how does your experience of the Synod shape your work and your vision as dean? And second, what wisdom do you think the Synod and this moment for the church has to offer those of us entrusted with the spiritual formation of young people at this time in the US?
Thank you very much. In my own responsibility of leadership at the school, the Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara University, I'm very attentive to the call of the Synod for institutions like mine to continue research in deepening and clarifying the meaning of synodality for local churches. So there is a direct call to institutions like mine to do that. And that is what we are doing in terms of our programming, developing what we call a synodal pedagogy that allows us to integrate elements of synodality into the teaching or theological education, creating programming that allows us to bring expertise on synodality into our faculty. These are all elements of what we're trying to build as a school. To the next question you raised, if you look at the final document, it really emphasizes formation. Formation is used many times. That formation that is integrated, that is inclusive, that everybody takes responsibility, first for formation of self, but also for formation of others. So there is a role for people in your position who have responsibility for the formation of young people in terms of how we form, not simply by transmitting ideas, but to quote the synodal document, by accompaniment. How do we accompany people as they go through their own formative processes? I think that's a model of formation that we're called to begin to pay attention to and in fact practice. But thank you very much.
Michelle.
Hi, thank you, Father. By participating in this process, I'm sure you went into it with certain views on the issues that were discussed. Did participating in the process and doing the listening change your views on important issues? And did it change how you are ministering to others on those issues?
Thank you very much, Michelle. I appreciate that. Just before the Synod, I was at our local parish in Berkeley, and it happened to be St. Phoebe's Day, St. Phoebe from the New Testament, Deacon and Paul's trusted partner. And it so happened that there were two women who were giving presentations about St. Phoebe. And it was very compelling testimony. It was just a week before the Synod was due to open. I approached them and I thanked them for their testimony. I requested their text to guide my own participation in the Synod. And many times I referred to their testimony. I told them that so they know. So to respond to your question, what I'm saying is that it's not so much that I was on this particular issue, because it was a question of women and women's ministry in the church. It wasn't so much that I was changed, I was convinced of the critical importance of this issue going into the Synod. And coming out of the Synod, I remain convinced of its importance. And therefore, my own responsibility as someone who benefits from this patriarchal setup to take appropriate steps to lift up these voices of people who really genuinely desire nothing but to be of service to the people of God. Thank you.
Nancy, we have one more. This will be the last question. Is there something pressing?
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. This is a very enlightening conversation. I'm wondering, as we look to the future, You know, what comes next? What's the next chapter beyond the synods? The synod both in 2023 and then this most recent one in 2024. And where we head forward from here, my understanding is that there will be another similar synod in 3 or 4 years to continue the conversation and the process. And I was curious to know about that. The other thing I'm concerned about is looking at questions of expectations being raised and wondering how those expectations around the different points of conversation, the way the church came together and had a conversation and its impact for the future, and how you see those expectations, where they're headed. Because I think one fear I would have is that through this process, that a lot of more Catholics are excited about the church and wanting to be able to support that energy moving forward. So
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nancy. In terms of formal processes, the way they set up the synod, its preparation is the actual synod itself, and then its implementation. There's no guarantee that the next synod, however, whenever that happens, will actually pick up the theme of synodality. It could be about something totally different. So what that signals to me is that we have an opportunity to engage with this particular process now and begin to carve out ways for implementing the ideas that have been surfaced in this particular, out of this particular process. And you would ask me, how? Well, I think at the very least, I would expect, in terms of expectations, that we'll be familiar with what these ideas are. There is a final document which is very accessible. I think at the very least, I want to be engaging with the ideas in this document because, as I mentioned, this is supposed to be a roadmap for us going forward. And so at least engaging with that. But beyond that, I mentioned the issue of agency. In terms of expectations, if I'm expecting that this change is going to come from the pulpit, I probably will be disappointed. I think it's going to be more efficient, or rather more transformative, if communities are able to identify what their particular roles are, even within their community, to foster elements of synodality. I think there is a role for everyone to play in this process, but we must take that responsibility of determining what that role is. And that is not to say we will not meet with resistance. There will be resistance, but we have to remember the agency is ours by virtue of our baptismal dignity. Thank you very much, Nancy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You're so wonderful.
Carol and Bator, thank you so much for your time with us. This has been really wonderful. I know we could go on much longer, but it is a school night, so we have to wrap it up. But I do want to invite you to stay at least for a few minutes, and I think you'll both be here for a few minutes to maybe talk a little bit more personally. Upstairs, right up here, there's a reception, so please come up there for at least a few minutes and say hello, and you can get your autograph or get your picture taken right now. But thank you again. You guys were terrific, and thank you all for coming tonight as well.